right, welcome everybody to this final summary workshop. Thank you very much for joining us today on this last workshop presentation in our series. So we've gone through about 12 hours of workshops together over the last couple of weeks. And today we're going to be summarizing those. So thank you to everyone who participated in the workshops, who provided a lot of great discussion and dialogue. And hopefully we can capture all of that in today's presentation and also get a little bit of feedback from you for the final pieces here before we move into the rest of the project that the CEC is embarking on in terms of nature-based solutions to address flooding in coastal cities. I'll do my best to speak slowly today for the interpretation. We are going to have a few interactive sessions where you can ask questions in the chat or the question and answer box. Alternatively, you can raise your hand and you'll be unmuted so that we can receive your comments. Before I get into the presentation today, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, who's going to open up with a few comments here from the CEC, and then we'll get started here for the next hour in this summary workshop.
Thanks, Danker. I just wanted to give a quick word to say thank you to all the participants and the presenters for sharing their insights and their expertise over the past 4 weeks. We've really enjoyed these workshops, and this is part of what the CEC does, brings together practitioners and experts from across the 3 countries on different environmental issues to share solutions and build a community of practice. And this workshop series was the first installment or activity as part of this new project on nature-based solutions for coastal flooding. And we'll be continuing over the next 2 years with developing reference tools, materials, and trainings and other activities. So please stay tuned, and you can always contact me. I believe my contact information will be shared at the end, but you can contact me with any questions. And thank you again for sharing your expertise, because this has really helped us orient the rest of the project to fill gaps and opportunities that have been identified here. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, great, thank you for that. And we did actually get a question already from Greg Ma, whether or not the recordings will be made available. Maybe Lauren, you want to answer that question before we start today?
Yes, I can answer that. This recording of today's workshop will be available. And then the presentations of all the panelists from the previous workshops will be available on the CEC website event page as well. We'll send out the links for that. The first workshop presentations are already available, and we'll be adding more as they get translated. And then this one should be posted in the next couple of days.
Great. Thank you, Lauren, for clarifying. So let's start off today and jump right into our presentation. I'll be the main presenter today, but with me as well is also the same team that you've seen along the way for all these workshops, including Jessica, Christian, and Lucy. So today's schedule, we'll go through each of the 3 themes that were highlighted throughout the workshops. So that's co-benefits, retrofitting gray infrastructure, and monitoring. And I'll give a quick summary, about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a group discussion on the gap identification of each of these topics. So hopefully we can get through this today. It's a bit of a tight schedule, so I may rush here and there. But hopefully you can catch the recording or a copy of the slides afterwards. So again, as has been reiterated many times, this really lays the foundation for this North American community of practice. And the hope here is that practitioners from Mexico, Canada, and the United States regularly come together to share information like we've been doing here on this workshop series. It's been really great to see the experiences from Mexico to Canada shared, and I think there's a lot of great information that came out of that. The key, of course, of this whole workshop series was to identify gaps in knowledge, which is what the focus of today's summary webinar is all about. So again, focusing on our 3 main themes that have been prominent throughout the workshop series. So first, let's jump into all the work that was reviewed with the co-benefits of nature-based solutions. We had a really great panel of speakers So this is just a quick reminder of those speakers. You can see we had 7 talks, again, representing Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And each talk had a key sort of question or theme, which I really think helped focus the talks and added some structure. So we had first Joanna discussing, what are the nature-based solution co-benefits and how do we define them? We also had several case studies presented throughout the workshop series that were really helpful. Actually, I think most of the presenters shared case studies, and hopefully we can summarize those as well. Then we wanted to talk about how to prioritize nature-based co-benefits. So really, both identifying and then prioritizing them, since there can be so many. And then how do you monitor and measure these co-benefits came up later in the third workshop series, which was very interesting. And also co-benefits was very much a community-based type of approach, so that it requires lots of partnerships, which was evident throughout the discussions we had. And of course, there's quite a bit of barriers to advocating for co-benefits. So one of the first activities we did was to identify co-benefits. So I think that's really sort of the basis or the starting point. And we broke into 3 breakout rooms of wetlands and mudflats, dunes and beaches, and islands and reefs. And in each of these, we identified co-benefits according to 3 categories, whether they were environmental, economic, or social. And typically that is what you'll find. You'll find that co-benefits are binned in these, and then of course there might be some overlap. And of course, the best type of co-benefit is one that has an element of all 3 of these categories. So this was a really interesting activity. And I think a lot of great ideas came out of this. So for example, in wetlands and mudflats, of course, a social benefit is that it offers flood protection. There's quite a bit of environmental benefits, protection against land erosion. Some of these benefits fall in between all categories. So for example, they mitigate hazards such as flooding and erosion. That could be a bit of a hybrid of environmental, social, and economic benefits, which is great. So yeah, that was the discussion for wetlands. Dunes and beaches, I think they're a little bit of a different category here, and you can see that in the sticky notes as well. We had things such as tourism there, which I think was a good one. Recreational values of large dune and beach systems. Of course, they also offer coastal protection. Interesting there, and under economic, there was jobs. I think in some of the discussions that was refined a little bit further. I think more information was discussed on what that actually means. And then finally, islands and reefs. So a lot of good information there on habitat for juvenile fish species, aquatic species. They have wave breaking properties, providing sheltered areas. Provides potentially places for recreation and swimming, and also safe harbor for vessels. They can act as a natural breakwater, so lots of really good ideas there. So going on from the identification of co-benefits, we moved on to understand some of the gaps in knowledge related to realizing and illustrating the co-benefits. So a lot of times we are focusing on perhaps 1 or 2 key benefits of these types of solutions, but it can be a little bit more challenging to quantify and identify all the other secondary or tertiary benefits. So again, with wetlands and mudflats, there was a lot of really great ideas. I think there was ideas about increased adoption of global blue carbon standards, how to adapt large-scale projects, co-benefits into specific coastal protection projects. So going from regional to local projects. In social, there was a lot of talk about, specifically Mexico, local communities and traditional practices and knowledge that are often overseen or forgotten. I thought that was a really interesting discussion. Here, another question is how to assess intangibles, which are hard to monetize, particularly in developing countries. And I think that theme of how do you monetize these sort of more qualitative benefits, and how do you demonstrate the economic value and benefits, that actually came up in all 3 of these, which was a great point. In dunes and beaches, again, we have quite some good information there. more emphasis on indigenous perspectives. There is perhaps a lack of long-term monitoring in dune and beach systems, which can be difficult since they're such dynamic systems as well, and that comes to funding as well in terms of being able to do repetitive monitoring to understand how these systems behave and what the benefits of them are. You'll have to excuse me, there's quite a few here in Spanish, so I'll let you read those yourself. And then finally, islands and reefs. Again, speaking of traditional knowledge, incorporating that and that as a co-benefit as well, and using storytelling or traditional storytelling in illustrating the co-benefits. Another note here you see is easier to track co-benefits quantitatively, but lots of benefits are qualitative. So I think that was a prominent theme throughout this, this co-benefits section. So then we had 3 case studies, and we looked at mangrove restoration in Yucatan, we looked at berm and dune construction in New Jersey, and we looked at the Living Dike Initiative in British Columbia. Now I'm running a little short of time already, and we're only 15 minutes in, but for each of these case studies, we identified co-benefits. So for the mangrove restoration, there was a lot of great discussions on the habitat diversity. It's a nursery for species like fisheries and shrimp. There's carbon sequestration benefits, mitigate urban heat islands. I mean, these are fantastic co-benefits, improving water quality, ecotourism. It's an extremely comprehensive list. I think this group did a really great job. For the berm and dune construction, there was some direct benefits. So of course it has to protect against erosion and flooding. And then a huge list again of co-benefits. And these really align nicely with those identified as well for the mangrove restoration project. So we're seeing things like social cohesion, water quality, increased biodiversity, increased tourism. So really nice lists here that I think are great lists for everyone to carry forward and use in their projects. And then the Living Dike Initiative, again, we had some direct benefits specifically also related to migratory bird habitat, coastal protection, wave attenuation, recreation. And then again, other things such as also the opportunity for First Nations to participate and to offer stewardship functions within the projects, places that could be used for traditional foraging, gathering, and hunting. Sort of a cultural and spiritual well-being associated with these kinds of nature-based solutions. So lots of really great co-benefits identified. And then again, we also talked about barriers. So, there are conflicts between economic sectors. There is difficulty of communication between disciplines, following through on these projects due to government changes. I think that's a really good one. Again, the New Jersey example, sediment supply into the system. So they really have to bring in a lot of sediment from the outside. Additional, there's some solutions to this, which is phasing and financing considerations. So I think that was a key theme throughout the whole workshop, was to really look at how these projects could be financed long-term, and then to really implement these long-term adaptive management plans, which is very important. And then finally, the Living Dike Initiative. Again, we had some barriers, overlapping jurisdictions. And I think that one came through on all of them again. Permitting and legislation, perhaps there isn't very good legislation in place to support these types of projects. So these are all very, very good and also relevant to all of the locations. And then really the solutions is increased dialogue, increased communication, involving all the stakeholders from the early onset. A lot of these issues can be solved by bringing people together and by having multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder groups, which is really something that came through in all of these presentations. Great. So here for the gaps, I've kind of summarized all of the gaps here from these case studies. And generally what you'll see is, general project planning guidance needed for local and regional contexts. So really additional government involvement. Again, like I said, improved public and community involvement. Again, huge theme. financial resources, better understanding and integration of ecological considerations into the engineering design and practical functional elements of putting these projects together. And then finally, improve technical standards, guidance, and resources. So those are the kind of the broad themes of barriers and gaps. And then of course, there's a lot more underneath that. So although we were running a little bit behind schedule here, I think it would be great to take a bit of time to ask people to, in the chat window, or to raise their hand, what are some obvious gaps that perhaps we're missing from this list, or that you feel are really important to highlight. I'll open the floor up to people now to contribute that. Please, as much as possible, try and put them in the chat or the Q&A window. And while people do that, I do want to ask Lauren, there's a question from Joanna, if there's going to be publication of the workshops. There might be a good white paper coming out of this. That's a very nice point. Lauren, over to you.
Yes, thank you. At this time, we're not planning on creating a report from these workshops. This was meant as a first step, and the next step is to develop more report style reports on these topics, but it's something we'll keep in mind, and the input from this workshop will feed into those reports.
Okay, great, thanks for clarifying. All right, I'm just going to switch over here to the Q&A and the chat. But don't be shy, feel free to put anything you want in the chat here. Not getting any feedback at the moment? Is there anything anyone wants to add here? Raise your hand. Okay, so here we got, regarding funding, financing support, it's important to emphasize the need for funding at all stages of a project. Yes, very good point. Yeah, and I think that came through in a lot of the discussions throughout the 3 weeks, was how to manage these solutions long term. And sometimes these solutions require much more maintenance and active adaptive management. And therefore the funding long term is much more important than for some other projects, which are more hands-off, but of course also less elegant. Complex and overlapping jurisdictions, yes, exactly. That one really, really came through in a lot of discussions, and it can be a huge barrier. And I know that certainly here in Canada, we have issues with that, where that can be a showstopper for some of these projects. It is also important to train qualified human resources. That's a great one there, yeah. Then Enda says he recalls some discussion around the need to involve more social science experts in projects to better characterize co-benefits. That's a good one as well, Enda. Yes, the social benefits. So again, going back to our diagram, looking at environmental, economic, and social benefits. Great. Okay, I think we're going to move on to the next section here. So retrofitting existing infrastructure using nature-based solutions was our second workshop series. So we spent about 4 hours on this particular topic. Again, we had a great panel of speakers. We had, instead of 7, we actually had 6 speakers. Again, we broke out these speakers with specific questions or topics. At the beginning, we had Jeff King really give us an overview of the opportunities for nature-based solutions retrofitting within an aging infrastructure portfolio. I think that's a very interesting question, and one that is very relevant. You know, replacing existing infrastructure with maybe hybrid combinations of green-gray infrastructure, or just fully nature-based solutions. Scott gave examples of nature-based solutions versus traditional infrastructure solutions. Then we had Monique give us an interesting talk about, what stages can we perform nature-based solutions retrofitting within a project life cycle or within a infrastructure life cycle. Phil spent some time sharing with us the knowledge barriers and data gaps that hinder nature-based solutions retrofitting. We had to talk about the legal and financial responsibilities of nature-based solutions retrofitting. And finally, Kevin shared some examples from a municipal, or actually from a wastewater treatment or sewage district, perspective on incentives for retrofitting infrastructure with nature-based solutions versus more traditional infrastructure. So the first exercise we did as part of this series was to do a breakout with 3 groups with the same area of shoreline in New York City. And this was a very, densely populated and highly developed shoreline. That was a hardened shoreline on the harbor. And the idea here was to come up with solutions for future pressures from climate change, sea level rise, storm surge. And one group looked at traditional infrastructure solutions. One group looked at a hybrid of hard and green infrastructure solutions. And one looked at just purely nature-based solutions. So it was very interesting to see the contrasting options. So for the traditional solution, it looks a bit like an iceberg, but it's just a large revetment or wall, essentially, just making it higher, which really is a hold the line type approach. And it's quite traditional, and it's one that we've often looked at in the past. And of course, in the future, we're hoping that there's less and less of these types of solutions if possible. Of course, it's not always feasible to have a fully green solution or a hybrid solution even, but in some instances, it is a better alternative. So we identified some of the features of these solutions, but also the co-benefits and cost considerations. So, it obviously reduces flooding and has coastal protection, but there aren't many other co-benefits to this. Maybe, some species can benefit. The cost considerations, the relatively standard design, so it's really a well-known cost. There's not much maintenance, it's sort of easier to manage this type of traditional structure. So then we looked at hybrid solutions, and I think the hybrid solution was a bit of a raised boardwalk that connected the 2 piers, and the raised boardwalk underneath had reefs. And then closer to shore, there was small structures in the water with a little urban beach in behind it. I think there was an idea of putting in a swimming pool or a harbor swimming area like they have in Australia. There was an idea of really making it a social space to gather with amenities, beach amenities. It is New York, so I don't know how much beachgoers there would be, but it would be a place for people to gather and perhaps enjoy the waterfront. This allows people to identify with the space. It could create, tourism space. So there was lots of interesting ideas about creating more value in this parcel of land. The cost considerations, it would have much more long-term upkeep. There was ideas that the private sector should play a role. Perhaps they could offer sponsorship, or they could invest in the project to demonstrate their interests in the social fabric of the city. Perhaps it could be a breakwater sponsored by Deloitte or something like that, but that could be stretching it. So there was a lot of talks about how you could try and finance this kind of project. And that was that one. The next one was a pure nature-based solution, which I think was also a little bit of a hybrid solution, but there was an idea to build offshore islands and reefs further out in the harbor to protect the shoreline, and then to green the shoreline as much as possible with vegetation, including things like oyster reefs. Of course, that's challenging with water quality issues sometimes, but nonetheless, a great idea. Cost consideration, again, just the maintenance needs, understanding the value of these benefits. Yeah, so I think that was the case studies. And then we had the second workshop where we had a quiz or a Mentimeter, I would call it. And we had some really fun and nice word clouds that were created. So first one was, what does retrofitting mean to you? And there's some really nice ideas here: sustainability, upgrading, ecological enhancement, adding vegetation, engineered ecosystems, lots of really great phrases and ideas and thoughts in this word cloud. Then we asked who should be responsible for retrofitting, and you can see really government comes out, and even smaller ones, in Spanish, of course, gobierno, but federal government, all levels of government, local government. So we see that, you know, it's in there, but there's other interesting smaller ones: community, citizens, developers, engineers, designers. So it's interesting to see that I think the responsibility for this lies on everybody, but of course it does need a main driver, which in a lot of cases is the public sphere. And then we talked a little bit about incentives for retrofitting, and of course there's human health, sustainability, economic, financial. So you know, how do you implement these incentives? And we looked at things like tax breaks, grant programs, legislation, you know, creating more awareness and education. So there's a social responsibility to do the retrofitting. Then we looked at the barriers to retrofitting, and again, you know, regulations came up, which I think is so interesting because it came up in almost every single one of these. Also, you know, there's financial proven examples I see there, which is great. You know, being able to demonstrate the success record or track record of these retrofitting solutions. And then, of course, we talked about how we could overcome these barriers. So increase government funding, strategic planning, look at the regulations and laws, again, multi-scale and multi-project and overall plan. I like this one a lot: prioritize programs over projects. That's very interesting. They talked about lobbying. So lots of really good ideas as how to overcome these barriers. So again, a bit of a summary here. We really need leadership by governments. That seems to be a big gap or barrier to implementation. I think this prioritizing programs over projects is a really interesting one. So maintenance monitoring incentives. So looking at the whole life cycle of the project, developing technical knowledge, that seems to be very important. We want to have examples, we want to have guidelines, we need more local knowledge. And finally, enhancing public perceptions. That's certainly going to be important, having people feel secure and safe with these kinds of flood protection solutions, and then also having, of course, the legal framework and land availability in place to realize these projects. All right, so we actually do have some time here to go over these gaps and barriers. So I'd like to turn back now to our chat window and also to the participants. Please, again, as before, highlight some of the missing gaps and barriers, or ones that you feel require a particular emphasis, or things that you feel are very important or that are not highlighted here. So please do go ahead and share. I'm also going to read out some of the other ones that I missed. Richard Cudney said he agrees with Enda on the social science experts for co-benefits, and also to establish the means to address unintended consequences. There were various examples of unintended consequences given during the first session. That's a good comment. Greg Ma again said a similar webinar series might be considered for the Great Lakes region. There are a few case examples of nature-based solutions in the Great Lakes. However, we could learn from the international community. Great comment. Okay, so please do go ahead and raise your hand, and you can speak up or put in the chat window what you feel are either missing gaps from this list or ones that are really important and we need to emphasize. Let's give everybody a few minutes here to enter that into the chat or in the Q&A window. Okay, so Claudia, you said information and communication for the acceptance of solutions. Yeah, very much agree with that. I mean, most of the engineering guidelines are still very much focused on traditional infrastructure solutions, funding mechanisms and projects. Their KPIs are still very much focused on traditional infrastructure solutions. So we need more information, and not only in the form of case studies, but also in terms of legislation, guidelines, a large variety there. And on retrofitting, it occurs to me that we, in Canada at least, lack good inventories of the state condition of existing infrastructure. That's another good point. And then we have a comment here from Phil. Lack of guidance and multidisciplinary aspects may tend to blur lines with respect to who is responsible for designs. That's right. It's always interesting when you see these projects that are being led by maybe an architecture or landscape architecture firm, or you see that projects are led by perhaps social scientists, or just a project led by engineers alone. And when you see the outcomes of these projects that are led by those groups just alone, the results usually aren't very positive. It's really when all these disciplines come together that the best types of projects come to fruition. We also have lots of comments coming in now, so it's great. From Claudia, we have a nice comment here as well. Claudia mentions that public perception for social acceptance. Yes, definitely. We need access to case studies. Many examples are not published or communicated to the general public, especially those cases that don't generate the expected results. Yeah, that's a good one. We had a comment like that, I think, in our second or third webinar series, where we said the failures aren't shared enough. We only share successes, but we can learn a lot from projects that don't go well. So we need to do a better job sharing projects that didn't go well, and to and to identify why. So I think some of these guidelines need to look at why do nature-based solutions projects fail. All right. There's two more comments from Augustin. He says complex and overlapping jurisdictions, and he also says legislation usually privileges retrofitting projects that do not include nature-based solutions. Yeah, those are two very good comments, Augustin, that I think have come up numerous times in our workshop series as well. Excellent. All right, I think we had a great discussion there. So I'm going to move on to our final workshop series, which was for the monitoring. Thank you everybody for these comments. So the last 4 hours of the workshop series, I actually got one more comment here that I'm going to read out. Jennifer Court, responding to Edna, this gap highlights the importance of national infrastructure assessment, announced but not launched. The scope includes natural infrastructure, but advocacy will be key to make sure that a broad range of green infrastructure assets are included. Yeah, very interesting. I'm sure that the infrastructure assessments are done on a local level, but a national assessment is probably something that would be interesting to see how different regions are faring, and to see if there's regional or location-specific trends that comes out of that. So we'll be keeping an eye out on that in Canada, at least. Very interesting. And it would be interesting to see if there's similar initiatives in the US or Mexico. I just also want to make one more comment. Case studies keep coming up as being important. And I think that could be one of the things that this group of people on this call can tackle. We've got 40 plus experts and people involved in the field of nature-based solutions that have attended these workshops. I think one of the workshops we had close to 50 participants. That's an amazing resource, and you all have good examples and experiences. So one of the things that I hope comes out of this community here is the ability to share those examples and to collate them somewhere. All right, moving along. So again, we had 3 really great speakers, and each speaker had, again, one of these topics to focus their talk. Violetta gave us a really nice presentation on the purpose of monitoring nature-based solutions. Danica van Proestdij presented what information we need or want from monitoring. We then had a conversation about the appropriate timescales and frequency of monitoring, which was very interesting to get Bashkar's experience with many decades actually of monitoring in Chesapeake Bay. Then Chris Hauser had a presentation on the roles and responsibilities for monitoring the efficacy of nature-based solutions. Richard Cudney gave us a talk on how to integrate monitoring into the project lifecycle and project funding. And finally, Vincent Lees closed off our speaker series with a presentation on how can nature-based solution performance be compared to traditional infrastructure performance from a monitoring perspective. So the first activity we did was, again, 3 case studies, and each breakout room had a case study. We had a beach nourishment project in Cancun, we had a marsh creation project in New Orleans, and we had an intertidal reef project in Surrey, Prince Edward Island, Canada. And for each of these locations, there was a series of exercises to identify what kind of monitoring should take place, and to prioritize the monitoring and the timelines of this monitoring. And then finally, a discussion on who should pay or be in charge of this monitoring. So I'm just going to look at one question per site. So for the intertidal reefs in Surrey, PEI, the first question was to identify and prioritize monitoring objectives. And they had a great discussion in this breakout room and used the battery model. So before, after, control, impact. It's really nice that they actually applied that and used that. I think that's a great template. So before, the recommendation was to use a site survey. And with that, they were going to look at water depth, wave attenuation, community support, the wind direction, existing biodiversity. So lots of great physical identifiers, but also the community support. So then for current, they were going to look at bathymetry surveys, human influence on the reefs. So this is after the reefs were installed, of course. Boat wake monitoring and sea-dews, that's an interesting one as well. Beach retreat distances, erosion, wave attenuation, water depth. And then after, so this is more long-term, I think that I really like what they wrote there, consistency being key. So emerging factors, communication, community issues. So really kind of understanding that your monitoring has to be consistent over the long term to really observe trends and to be able to understand the performance of these reefs. And then finally, impact. So looking at fisheries, erosion, land ownership. So very nice job done by this group. Then for the marsh creation, there was a discussion on monitoring timelines. So the group broke things down into 4 categories: water quality, land elevation measurements, vegetation growth, and storm surge reduction. And then to each of those assigned a timeline. So water quality, you could perhaps monitor that seasonally and pre and post storms. Land elevation, perhaps biannually, the spring and the fall, and looking specifically at vegetation growth and decay. I believe that should actually fall under the vegetation growth measurements, again, in the spring and the fall. And then storm surge reduction, continuous monitoring. So looking at installing gauges that continually monitor water levels to capture pre and post during storm conditions. So very interesting to see that monitoring can take place annually, seasonally, twice a year, or continuously, which is important to identify that before you start a monitoring campaign. And then the final one was the beach nourishment group, who looked at all those questions as well, but then specifically here I'm highlighting that the monitoring gaps And they brought up things such as unexpected situations, like sargassum arrival to beaches will affect the project. I think that's a great example of a unexpected event that will impact monitoring. And that should always be accounted for in setting up a monitoring plan. Then there was also a comment on long-term funding and implementation. So again, this whole discussion of funding over a project lifetime, having long-term funding available, who is in charge of this monitoring. Again, they're saying that in this case, there might be quite a bit of money available from the hotel industry. And of course, there will be a lot of pressure from the hospitality industry to maintain the beaches. People come for the beach, they come for the ocean. And then again, they also discussed this idea of partnerships between academic institutions, government, and hotels to reduce costs. So again, the academic partners can take care of monitoring and analyzing data long-term, assessing trends, etc. So that was our first workshop. I think it was a really great discussion. And then in the second monitoring workshop, we had again a Mentimeter. So, why monitor nature-based solutions? I think there was a ton of different suggestions here, and there wasn't necessarily one that stood out. It was just a lot of different good ideas. Like, we're measuring the success of the project. We're trying to understand the performance of the project. You can learn and adaptively manage your project based on these monitoring results. So there's a lot of really great reasons why to do the monitoring. So who should be involved in planning and monitoring? And I like this one a lot because community really is a big one. And I think that comes through in a lot of the discussions that we had, is that involving multiple stakeholders and the community in monitoring plans is very helpful. Some monitoring, of course, has to be done by trained specialists and experts who are usually, have academic backgrounds or part of government organizations or consultants. But there is definitely also a role for the community and for more stakeholders to get involved. So I really enjoyed those discussions that we had on how to engage the community in sort of citizen science or citizen monitoring and feedback, and having little surveys and making sure to incorporate that in the monitoring process. Then we asked, to prioritize which shoreline features need more regular monitoring. And it's interesting, generally, people felt that the nature-based solutions needed more monitoring than traditional solutions, like salt marshes and mangroves having the greatest need. And then, of course, riprap slopes and seawalls having the least. So that, I think, is a very important consideration, is that perhaps, these nature-based solutions do need a little bit more monitoring, and that demonstrates the need to have the funding in place and to have the organization in place to do so, and B, to really have that planning in place ahead of time, that the monitoring is done in a consistent way, and that it's done to really look at the results and use those results to make decisions. So barriers to monitoring, again, funding, that's a big one, right? So the lack of knowledge, training, again, monitoring isn't necessarily easy to do and requires very project-specific plans. There's not really a one-size-fits-all monitoring plan. I think we found that from the 3 case studies, each different case study had a very different monitoring plan in place, which means that monitoring is not something that can be standardized. It is probably quite project-specific. The same types of tools and the same types of methods can be used, but they have to be adapted to the project. So that's certainly an important one, and that requires expertise. It requires trained professionals. And that's why it's so important to have workshops like these, to bring people together who can do that kind of work in the future, to actually implement projects and then monitor them. So we also had a small breakout activity in the second workshop series. This Small breakout activity, again, was in our 3 theme areas: wetlands and mudflats, dunes and beaches, and islands and reefs. And we used the SMART metric, and we looked at the co-benefits of each, so environmental, economic, and social. So this was a neat activity because, in my opinion, it sort of brought everything together from the whole 12-hour workshop series. We're looking at project-specific nature-based solutions. We're looking at the co-benefits. We're looking at the sort of the whether or not they're attainable. So for the wetlands and mudflats, monitoring environmental parameters, the group looked at plant growth and cover, and that was measurable with drones, and it needs funding, and it's very relevant, and it should occur twice a year. So it's very clear. They also looked at sediment accretion, which again can be done with profiles, geoposition tools. Again, it's attainable, but it's definitely going to need long-term funding. And again, it should occur about twice a year. For the dunes and beaches, to monitor economic incentives, the idea was there to look at tourist revenue, which you could measure for sure. You could gather data from local businesses and municipalities. And then it's very relevant because, of course, we're creating jobs through this type of environment. And islands and reefs, a lot of fantastic ideas there were thrown around for social. So, food security, education, ecotourism, mental health, ways to measure these things, looking at education levels, household incomes, number of visitors, and over the longer scale, looking at annual job creation, tourism revenues, education. So the social one is certainly a bit of a blend, in my opinion, of economic and environmental co-benefits as well, and monitoring those. So in summary, the gaps and barriers in knowledge and information and barriers to implementation of monitoring. The first one at the top of the list, funding and financial resources, and certainly a big one. The upfront planning required, I think that's, again, planning both the responsibility of who monitors, planning what to monitor, planning how frequently to monitor, and then who pays for the monitoring and then stores that information and disseminates the information. And I think what's so important to stress here is you can monitor and collect all this information, but it shouldn't just sit on a shelf. The data needs to be disseminated, it needs to be looked at, and the decision makers and stakeholders need to see this data. So there needs to be a transparency of this data. I think ultimately that allows projects to succeed, and then to make actions, or to make, I guess, to take action based on what the data is telling us. If the project isn't performing well, action should be taken to rectify that. So it's not just monitoring, it's also taking action with the outcome of the monitoring data. Again, technical knowledge. Data monitoring requires trained individuals, people who know how to create these plans, people who know how to conduct the monitoring. Improved monitoring logistics and resources. So again, you need a lot of equipment to do monitoring sometimes. Sometimes it's hard to implement the monitoring, the timing of the monitoring. And finally, there are sometimes regulatory and political barriers to monitoring. And in some places that could even come down to things like corruption or conflicts between jurisdictions and agencies. So that summarizes the monitoring workshops. So we have time for a few comments. Please do, again, go ahead and in the chat window, I see a first comment here coming in, changing the idea of monitoring as an extra cost. That's a great point. It's not an extra cost. It's really an investment in the longevity of the project, the success of the project, and also the community. So I really like that comment. That's a great one. Let's get the comments coming in. So please do take your time and maybe identify what you think is missing in this list, or highlight what you think is really important. And what we'll do at the end of this, we'll compile all the comments and put them into the PowerPoint here from what you said so that we have it on record. So we have about 3 or 4 minutes here for people to share their comments. Please do go ahead. All right. Probably a pretty comprehensive list at this point. Great. We've got some emphasizing the importance of establishing clear baselines. Ah, great. Thanks so much, Richard, for mentioning that. I actually think I failed to mention that in my talk. Yes, baselines are important. How do you measure failure or success or progress or change if you don't have a good baseline? And timing of this baseline also. Sometimes you need 2 baselines, a baseline during certain seasons. So that's very important. We also have a comment from Violetta who says that identifying the appropriate timing of monitoring according to nature-based solutions. Yep, that's very important. I think identifying that timing is so specific to the project location and the project itself as well. You want to promote participatory monitoring with local actors. Yes, definitely. I think that also helps with community buy-in and participation. It's a great comment from Claudia there. Thank you. I'm going to leave about 1 more minute here for everyone to share their final thoughts. Richard, establish a theory of change as much as possible. Interesting. Perhaps, Richard, I think you mean sort of like a change management, or maybe you want to elaborate a little bit on that comment. Bird mass is a hypothesis of change. Yeah, perhaps it is. We could get Richard to answer that one. All right, so while we answer this, I'm just going to wrap up here in the last few minutes. I think we've hit the hour mark. Sorry, Violetta, I'm just going to grab your 1 comment here to make sure we have that. Perhaps it refers to having a baseline in which, against which to compare. Then Richard says, every intervention is meant to produce a change. Theory of change refers to that. Ah, yes. And I think then Violetta's comment is very appropriate because, of course, you have to have a baseline against which to compare. Great. Thank you. So this is a bit of a wrap up. I think the next steps here, Lauren has actually shared links in the chat here. So she said, we would appreciate your feedback on the workshop series. If you have not done so, please complete the survey. And there's a link to the survey in the chat. And again, like Lauren has said, this is a 30-month project from the CEC. And this was really the first month or 2 of that project. So the idea will be to continue to convene this group of practitioners and to really advance the gaps that we identified. So the gaps in the summary presentation, to try and move the information, the body of knowledge forward so that we can try and address those. So again, if you have any questions, please do reach out to Lauren. Here is her contact information. She's the project lead for the ecosystems unit. There's her email and her phone number. I believe that will also be available in another place. So you can note that down here, or you can reach out and get that information as well. So this is the end of our 13-hour-long webinar series. I want to thank you all very much. Muchas gracias. Merci beaucoup. It's been a really, really great experience to be with you here for the last couple of weeks and to get all this really enriching information from you in this participation. I hope everyone's had a good time and has enjoyed this, and we look forward to moving forward with everything that was gathered during these presentations. So thank you again to all participants, and I'll just move it over to Lauren there for a final closing remark from the CEC.
Thank you, Danker. And I just want to echo the comments in the chat. Thank you to DHI and the whole team at DHI for facilitating these workshops. This has been great. And to everyone that participated, we'll be sure to keep you in the loop on when there's updated materials from this workshop series. And as Danker mentioned, if there's case studies or anything like that, as we move forward in this project, we'll be sure to get in touch.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. And we'll sign off now. Bye-bye.